Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It is our pleasure to bring Nancy Roberts to campus. I just wanted to make a quick note. Some of you requested a copy of the Slave Yards translation. It is here. We will be giving them out at the end of the talk, so please do not leave without grabbing it. It gives me a lot of personal joy to introduce Nancy to you all today, in part because she set me on the track I followed for my dissertation and then for my later monograph project. And what I mean to say is it is her translation of Ghada Saman's trilogy about the Lebanese civil wars that got me interested in doing the research I'm doing now. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I'd like to start our talk with a conversation about how you got into what seems like a rather unlikely subject area for you. So you are from Wichita, Kansas, and you went to college in Kentucky. So how did literature in Arabic enter onto your radar?
Okay. Well, I initially thought I was going to I thought I would probably major in political science when I was a younger person. I campaigned for McGovern and whatever it was, what year that was that he ran for president, and I was very interested in politics. When I got to college, I decided to I decided to major in psychology and religion, both of which were very important in my life. I struggled with mental illness, and I wanted to help others. So that was my initial goal. So when I was in my senior year, I decided to move into the dorm. I was very much an introvert. I said I should go live with people. You know, I should really be out there with people. So I'm going to go live in the dorm. So I forced myself to go live in the dorm. And while I was there, I met a young woman from Iran, and I was a very evangelical Christian at the time. I wanted to convert her to Christianity. So I proceeded to study about Islam so that I could figure out Fatima, which was her name. You know, she doesn't know anything about Islam because she'd grown up under the Shah, and they didn't teach them about Islam, so she couldn't tell me anything. And I thought, okay, well, I'll figure it out myself. I started studying about Islam. I said, oh, the language of Islam is Arabic. Okay, well, I should study Arabic then. Just, it happened really rather spontaneously, and I said, so I started looking for somebody that would teach me Arabic on the campus of Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And there were very few people that could do that. The only person available was the local resident scholar on Islam, who was an American, but he studied American, so he agreed to teach me whatever he could. I signed up for an independent study with him. He gave me the materials that he used in the CASA program in Cairo, and I was fascinated, you know, all the squiggly lines and strange sounds, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. And being the evangelical Christian that I was, I had missions on my mind, and I should go now. God's calling me to the Middle East, and I had all these thoughts, and I had wanted to do a PhD in clinical psychology in a particular theological seminary. And I hadn't set my goal, I hadn't spread my net very far. I had my heart set on a particular place. So I kind of said to myself and God, as I understood God at the time, that if I get into this program, that's what I'll do. And if I don't, I'll go to the Middle East. Well, I didn't get into the program, and I hadn't laid any B. There was no plan B in that area. So I took off for the Middle East in around, I think it was 1979, as part of a semester-long program. It was run by the Reformed Bible College here in Michigan. I don't remember if it's Grand Rapids, I think. Anyway, we were immersed in Arabic culture, study about Islam. I became first interested in the Palestinian issue. I was converted from being pro-Israeli to being pro-Palestinian at that young age through this experience. We lived for 2 months immersed in Egypt, basically. I lived in an orphanage with young little Egyptian girls for a couple of months. Came back and said, yep, I should go to the Middle East. But how will I do that? I thought of becoming a nurse. I tried nursing. I said, no, I will not become a nurse. Then I said, no, language is my thing, which it was. So I decided that I would get a master's in applied linguistics to teach English as a second language. I chose, so I was accepted into a couple of places. I chose IU Bloomington because they had an Arabic program. And I could spend all my free time studying Arabic. So I went to IU, became immersed in much more interested in Arabic than I was in my linguistic courses. So they were okay, but Arabic was the really most important, interesting thing to me. So I went, I taught in Lebanon for a year, I taught in Kuwait for 5 years, and throughout this time I was in love with Arabic, basically. And it was, my relationship with Arabic was taking on a life of its own. I was going through changes in terms of my worldview, what I was there for, and why I was there in the Middle East. Everything was in flux, except for my love for Arabic. I just seemed to stay. It didn't change. So, let me see. I was living in Kuwait. I think it was 1983. I was sitting in my apartment. I used to buy Arabic publications to just read them and get vocabulary and get familiar with the language. There was a particular magazine called Wahia. It's for teenagers, and it was just sweet, lots of sweet articles about human interest topics. And there was this poem in the magazine. I thought, oh, that is so sweet. I wonder how that would sound in English. So I, started trying, and then pop into my head came this idea of becoming a translator. I'd never thought about it before, and suddenly it was there. And so that was the day, literally the hour, when the idea first came into my head. The idea of literature per se hadn't really come, but just the fact that it was a poem, of course, seems significant. So I kind of hid that away, filed that away. I went back to the U.S. I came back to the U.S. in 1987, and in 1990, after some more searching and so forth, I started a master's degree back at IU Bloomington, this time in Arabic, with the idea of becoming a translator. So, of course, if you're doing a master's in a language, literature obviously comes part of your life, and you think about it more. So I did. I began thinking more about literature at that time. And I don't remember if it was, I think it was maybe before I went to Bloomington. And I don't remember how it happened, but I read Ayyam by Taha Hussein. It's his autobiography. And it was just wonderful. I just loved reading it. I loved his story, the way he tells it, and the fact that he was blind and overcame all those obstacles in his life. It was very inspiring. And maybe that might have contributed to my desire to translate literature. So that's how that happened.
Well, I love how serendipitous and circuitous that path was. It definitely gives hope for the idea that one can have first, second, third, fourth, fifth careers and kind of find your way towards a passion. I love what you said about kind of having the opportunity to have your worldview changed by the experience you had in the Middle East. You gave the example of your politics as pertains to Israel and Palestine. I kind of want to segue into how you translated your first novel, which was about Lebanon, and it was one of the trilogy pieces that Gladys Imam wrote. How did you come across this novel about Lebanon and its wars in the first place, and perhaps maybe even a little bit more importantly, why did you think an English-speaking audience needed to have access to it?
Well, I was first introduced to Gaza Weddings by a professor of mine at IU. I guess he had a particular interest in her. And so I read a number of her things while I was a grad student at IU. And of course, the fact that I lived in Lebanon made it, particularly, it drew me, more than maybe some other things that I'd read. And so after I finished my studies, I did some research to see if her works had been translated into English. And I was surprised to find that nothing had been translated at all. So since the idea of translating literature was very attractive to me, I found her. I was able to figure out where she was. I wrote to her, that is, the author, and asked her for permission to translate it, and just got started. So, yeah, that's how that started. Did you ask me something else?
Yeah, how did you think at the time that you were doing the translation, was this kind of more just for you? You were interested in personally doing it? Did you want more English speakers to learn something about the Middle East through your translation?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that was always there. It was for me too. It was, just the experience of conveying this story in my own language was the process itself, the intellectual aspect of it, all aspects of it were attractive to me. And I'd been basically working on cultural bridge building ever since I'd gone to the Middle East. It was just part of the way I think. So yeah, the idea of conveying this, giving Americans an opportunity to read more about the Middle East was always part of my thinking.
Well, so now I have to ask, because you said that you encountered Ahlam's work in Arabic, and on a whim, kind of as a graduate student, you said, I think I want to try and translate this. I'll contact her myself, ask her if I can. How do you go from that to being under contract with publishers, publishing Arabic literary greats like Ibrahim, Nasrallah, who are very well known at the time, Naguib Mahfouz? I mean, that seems like a huge learning curve. What was that process like?
Well, it was there were a number of years passed. So I finished translating for Gaza Weddings, the last one I did for her, which was al-Koni, the last of the trilogy. I think I finished it in 1999. It didn't find a publisher until 2003. I had to, of course, go find a publisher, so I was sending it out to different publishers. So in the meantime, I translated for the State Department in Jordan. Then I left that because ideologically it was not comfortable, and then more or less also serendipitously I kind of fell into translating Islamic material. I read a book by Muhammad Saeed Ramadan al-Bukhari. He's the late scholar from Syria. And he had written something about Islam and women in Islam in the West, and I thought it was intriguing. I didn't agree with everything he said, but I thought it would be interesting to translate it. So I contacted Dara Fikr in Damascus, asked them if they would agree to let me translate it. And they said yes, but first there's something else we'd like you to do. And it was another book by Bukhari called Fiqh Sirat al-Nabawiyya, or the jurisprudence of the prophetic biography. So I did that, and that was my first exposure to translating Islamic material. Being married to a Muslim who was very, very knowledgeable and so forth, the hurdles, I was able to get past the hurdles by asking a lot of questions. And then I did the one about women in Islam in the West. This was followed by another translation that also just fell into my lap, more or less. Abdurrahman Jaziri, an Islamic scholar, wrote a book called al-Fiqh al-Madahib al-Arba'a, which means it's jurisprudence according to the four schools of jurisprudence. and it's a comparative jurisprudence, and the first volume is called Ibadat. So it's all about the rights of worship in Islam. It's about 800 pages in Arabic, and it ended up being something like 1,300 pages in English. So I was working on that for about a year or more. So throughout this time, there was no literary translation going on. Then in 2003, I translated a book on Sufism by Ibn al-Iskandari, on the lives of, it's called البيضاء في مناقب الشيخ عباس المرسي وشيخه الحسن الشاذلي. The subtle blessings of the saintly lives of Abbas al-Mursi and his Sheikh Hassan. So that was very edifying for me. I really enjoyed translating that very much. It was about their spiritual experiences and their virtues. And it was kind of a hagiographical treatment of their lives. So I was being exposed to a lot of different things. Then in 2005, I received an email from Neil Hewison at AUC Press in Cairo, and they work with Syracuse University Press, which had published my last translation by Levis and then. So they invited me to contract with them to start doing other authors. My first work with them was called al-Koni, which we changed the title to Over the Bridge. It's by Muhammad al-Salih. The second one was by Hada Bedri. She has a novel called Muntaha. The third was al-Bashmuri by Salwa Bakr. And that was really, that was an exciting book to work on. I was really, really excited to do that book because it's a historical novel. It's set in 8th century or 9th century Egypt, and it highlights the interaction between Muslims and Christians, the Copts and the Muslims back in those times, and all the things going on. And it was, according to Salwa Bakr, she had drawn actual historical sources to do this, and they were some in Coptic and Coptic, Persian, about 6 different languages were incorporated into that work. So I had to do a lot of research, and I really wasn't really thinking, I think that Salwa Bakr was fairly known by that time as well, and but I wasn't thinking I'm translating for somebody that's really well known. I was just immersed in the process of translating. And then the next one after that was, I think, Time of White Horses by Ibrahim Nasrallah. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know this until just a couple of weeks ago, in fact. In a forum with Ibrahim himself, he was talking about that time. And he said that they had given that book to another translator and they weren't happy with the sample. And Neil Hewison had suggested me to Ibrahim, and which of course that makes me feel wonderful. Anyway, he suggested my name, and Ibrahim and I worked together. I really loved working with him. So it didn't feel like a transition. Everything was just in a flow.
So it sounds like it was kind of a picking up of momentum. What I really like about what you were saying was the fact that you made time for enjoyment of the text that you were translating. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that. You have, in an earlier conversation, kind of described your hands as doing the translating, right? That you're thinking less, right? And you're kind of being led in a way. Can you talk a little bit about how you find translation to be transformative personally? How was your process of translation?
Okay, well, let's see. Well, just in terms of the process, first I read whatever novel or book it is that I'm going to be translating. If it's an academic work, I may or may not read it to the end before I start translating. And that is partly because the nature of academic work is that it's, let's face it, it's drier. So it's just hard to get to the end all at once. And basically you don't have a plot. So for those, I allow myself to read the first chapter, go back and start translating. It gets me a sense of where we're going. But when it comes to novels, no, I would always read it from beginning to end. And I read it as if I were reading. I don't let myself go to the dictionary unless I absolutely have to. I try to just be with the novel, experience the characters and the flow and everything emotionally and everything the way I would any novel. I also take notes though. I take notes on the names of the characters and their personalities and the events. And that's partly just to help me remember what happened earlier so that I can make more sense of the novel. And it's also because I know now from experience that I'll be asked probably to write a synopsis and an analysis. I may be asked to do that. And this helps immensely if I have all those notes written. So I do that. Then I go back to the beginning and I begin translating. This time I look up words. I reread. Let's say I reread the first chapter. This time I really go more deeply into it. I start to notice, what passages I need to, that will be more difficult. I look up words. I scribble in the margins. And actually when I'm reading the first time, I sometimes scribble in the margins because I think, oh, that would be a great way to translate a certain phrase, so I gotta write it down before I forget. And then in terms of so when I'm translating, unlike, let's say, in a newspaper article or something just very straightforward, when you're translating literature, you can think of so many different ways that you might translate a phrase or a sentence. You might think of 4 or 5 different ways. So I just write them all, I type them all out. Every single possibility that comes to my mind, I put them down. And then usually I transliterate that sentence or whatever in brackets. That cements it in my mind more, and often I feel like I understood the sentence better when I've transliterated it, so I go back and I work on it some more, and I keep going that way. So by the time I finish, let's say, a draft of a chapter, it's 3 times longer or 4 times longer than the actual text is going to be. And then I go back and work through things that I narrow down the possibilities and figure out what things I need to ask the author about. If the author is living, I always contact the author from the very beginning. And I don't wait till the end of the book. Like every chapter or so, I'll send the author questions. And that is really nice. It establishes a relationship with the author. And also, I've noticed that when I'm trying to formulate my questions, sometimes the question answers itself, so that I don't end up having to answer or ask about it.
You said that this process you find personally transformative too for yourself. So how would you say that it transforms you, being a translator?
That basically depends on the content of the novel. So, let's say in the slave yards, it was just, it was very emotional. I mean, I'd laugh and I'd cry and I just really experienced that novel in a very immediate sort of way. And so, in terms of personal transformation, though, I think that has happened maybe more in terms of living in the Arab countries and using the language on a daily basis and forming friendships and listening to people and soaking up the different kinds of expressions they use. They get under your skin, kind of. And you realize the richness of just what how amazing it is, what a wonderful privilege it is to have been able to live in another culture and experience, you know, a way of looking at things that's different, and have people welcome you into their lives even though you're a foreigner. And there's a particular, just certain little things, you know, expressions in Arabic that become very dear, like for example, when a father is speaking to one of his children, he calls them Baba or Yaba, and it doesn't matter if it's a boy or a girl, he will call them Baba, and the mother will always call the children Yamma or Mama, and I thought, wow, that is so amazing. It means that they're identifying with their child, I don't know if that's impressed anybody else, but it really impressed me. I loved it so much. And I remember the first time my mother-in-law called me Yamma, and I thought, oh my gosh, I am so lucky. You know, and you know, now that I'm back in the United States, there are expressions I want to use them, because this is when you say that, and there's nothing to say. What do I say? Salamtik, Naiman, Isnoideki, all these things that we don't have anything that goes quite with them. So, of course, when I'm speaking with my daughters, I can say them, and they know what they know. But if I'm speaking with people who don't speak Arabic, I realize what a place those things have had, and what a function, a lovely function they perform. They're kind of ritualized in a way.
So let me ask you a question about that then, in conversation with the novel you just mentioned, The Slave Yards, the one up here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us a little bit of what that book is about? And then I'd also like you to talk about how one translates or cannot translate slavery between a Libyan context and one that American audiences who are reading your book in translation would be more familiar with. And I'm asking this in part because I think it has to do with what you were saying about this desire to be able to use certain terms, right, that kind of hit close to home in one context but have no translation in another. So let's talk about that with the slave yards.
Okay, so the first question that you asked about the slave yards was what it's about, and so the slave yards is set in Libya, near Benghazi, in the 19th century, the turn of the 19th and 20th century, under the Ottoman Empire. And so it deals with a slaveholding family, and so we're introduced to the life of these slaves in this particular household, and the members of the family, and how they relate to each other. The slaves, how they relate. Slaves relate to each other, how they relate to their masters, and so forth and so on. And we're also introduced to the slave trade. So we have these slave drivers, basically, who were bringing the slaves from more southern parts of the African continent up to Libya to be enslaved, to be, they're chattel, they're being transported, and it's really graphic. It's very harsh. It's the sexism as well as the racism and the violence and the degradation. It's all there. It's she doesn't, Najwa doesn't try to make any of it easier for us in the way she describes it. So it talks about, as well as, so the story revolves around actually a love relationship that develops between a slave owner and one of the slave women, and how it goes beyond just the concubinage. It goes beyond just the just pure enjoyment to a bond that forms between them, and all the complications that arise out of that. This man doesn't have, he feels that he's been robbed of agency by his family, that he does not have a true role. He doesn't have a real ability to make his own decisions about his life. His wife has been chosen for him. His profession has been chosen for him. And in some ways, his relationship with the slave woman is an act of rebellion against all of the restrictions that have been put on him. At the same time, he's not able really to break out. He's not able. He doesn't have the courage to say, she will be my wife, or and he even fails to acknowledge their child as his own before he dies. So that there's a lot of agony, there's a lot of his struggle and her struggle is all out there. So anyway, I don't want to go too long about that. Anyway, so essentially that is what the story revolves. Those are some of the things that it revolves around. Now, what was your second question?
So how do you find the process of translating the experience of slavery in the Libyan context for an audience who's more likely American reading your book? And for them, they have an understanding of what slavery is and looks like that is not what Najwa Bin Shatwan shows. So how did you negotiate those two worlds while translating?
Well, basically, as I see it, when I'm translating what's there. I'm not trying to tailor it to anybody. My job is to convey what's there, not to soften it, not to tailor it to any particular audience, except insofar as that will make it clearer to them what the author is saying. So, so my job is not to think about American slavery, it's to think about what's the slavery that's being conveyed in the book and to describe that. And then the reader, wherever that reader is, will then receive it according to his or her own experience, or see it in light of his or her own knowledge and experience.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, I'm going to read from this, since this is what Najwa, the author of the book, told you about her own experience. You said that she didn't see any connections between the subject of the novel she'd written and the broader history of enslavement of Africans in the diaspora, which was something that kind of surprised you at the time. Mm-hmm. You said it was because there were other Arabic language writers who'd written about slavery, and so it seemed that she was writing this book kind of in her own universe or bubble. Mm-hmm. And she said that she, at the same time, faced a lot of negative backlash from people who wanted to refuse or deny the existence of slavery in Libya's history. So how did that kind of conversation shape your understanding of the importance of the book?
Let's see. Well, I do remember that when I asked her, in fact, when I had that conversation, I might just go back to it. The brevity of her response was kind of breathtaking. I completely expected for her to go on and on about certain things, and all she had very little to say. I can find it. Maybe I can't. So, but I had asked her a fairly long-winded question about, how she saw her role as a... Okay, here it is. So I wrote to her. When you wrote The Slave Yards, dealing as it does with the issues of slavery, anti-black prejudice and discrimination, the oppression of women, and the role of Islamic teaching in supporting and perpetuating both slavery generally, and in particular the sex slavery of women, did you see what you were writing as part of a larger global conversation and or movement? If so, which particular movements or conversations? And she said, no, I gave no thought to any of this. I just wanted to tell a story well. Okay. And then I asked, were you inspired by other literary works, whether originally in Arabic or translated into Arabic, that deal with similar themes? If so, could you talk about them? And she said, no, there were none. So I felt I'd been basically, that was the end of the conversation. And I was very surprised. So then what did that do in terms of my perceptions? Well, it was a surprise, but I mean, she's the authority on these things. She wanted to tell a story well, and she told the story very well, in my opinion. She definitely succeeded in that. My understanding, or my way of looking at this, is that regardless of what her intention was, you know, once that book is out there, then other people are going to respond to it. And even if she didn't think of herself as starting a conversation or continuing a conversation, she is in fact doing that, regardless of what her intention was. I mean, someone else can pick up this book and read it in terms of the experience of blacks in the United States and their enslavement, and she would say, well, good. I'm sure that she would quite learn that, you know, and be happy that she's inspiring these conversations. So there's no conflict between her simple desire to tell a story well and the fact that now this book, I hope, is opening people's minds and understanding to a greater knowledge of Libya and its history and the universal nature or the tendency throughout history and across the globe for one group to oppress another. And in terms of the backlash and the tendency of some people in Libya to want to suppress the kind of things she was talking about, that's of course no surprise. Just look at the, what was the 1612
1619.
1619 Oh yeah, think of all the unbelievable backlash that we're getting. Oh no, that's not us. We don't. That's not. No. You're distorting history and so forth and so on. So that's also, it tends to be a universal kind of knee-jerk response when we're faced with things that are unpleasant.
Well, so I want to shift gears a little bit in geographic focus, but sticking to this topic of oppression, liberation, etc. You've translated quite a lot of works from Palestinian authors and or about Palestine, and so I'm kind of curious to know, of those, which one resonated the most with you, and also what do you think is important about translating Palestinian works for American or even international audiences?
Well, I would say the one that resonated the most for me was Time of White Horses by Ibrahim. And he talks a lot about village life. He has a lovely sense of humor. He brings in humor and very just folksy kinds of things that people do and say. I also really love the fact that horses, as the title suggests, are very important in this novel. And he talks about the love and reverence that people had in traditional Palestinian society for their horses. There are just some very touching passages about the relationship between people and their horses that I loved. I noticed that basically whenever there's that kind of in anything I read, when there's a connection between human beings and other species, I love that. It resonates with me a lot. And so then there was that one, and then there's The Lanterns of the King of Galilee. It was another historical novel, but it didn't resonate with me quite as much as Time of White Horses. The third one was, which has never been published so far. It's Kilimanjaro Spirits, Arwah Kilimanjaro, and the fourth one was Gaza Weddings. All those four were for Ibrahim Nasrallah. And actually, I've only translated for two Palestinian authors. It's just simply that I've translated a fair number by one author. The other one was Ahlam Barakat. It's a little book called اسمي الحركي فراشة, which is translated as my codename Butterfly, and it's actually for young adults. So, in terms of why I would want to translate, all my in-laws are Palestinians. I lived in and experienced and heard the stories for many, many years. My mother-in-law would just love to tell the stories, but painfully, of course, she would tell painfully the stories of being driven out of Jericho and having to walk all the way to Jordan. And how could I not want to translate about Palestine? I can't imagine not wanting to do that. And it may or may not have any influence on the outside world, because we know that Palestinian writers have been being translated for a long time, and we have gotten nowhere. So I have no illusions about how effective this will be. But just because we don't think something will be effective doesn't mean we won't do it, because it's a good thing to do. So I guess that's my take on that.
So of all the novels that you have translated, and I'll say novels because I know you said you translated Islamic jurisprudence and other types of works, government documents, right? So we'll stick with novels. Which was your favorite to translate?
I think it was that one. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay. What made it your favorite to translate?
Well, Najwa Bin Shatwan is really gifted in her ability just to... There's no obtrusiveness about her language. She doesn't try to draw attention to herself as an author. She just plunges you into the situation, and you're there, and you feel things. You laugh and you cry, and you get mad, and you hate the villain, and you love the protagonist, and you, and which is, I mean, isn't that what literature is all about in a way? And so, yeah, honestly, I feel that it was probably one of the most intense experiences in terms of translating a novel. And it was my favorite, yeah.
All right, so I would like to open this up to questions from other folks. So a reminder, everyone, this is being recorded, but if you would not like to have your voice being recorded, please let my colleague Julia know so she can take your question down. And if you could state your name also when you ask your question for Nancy.
Hi, my name's Cecilia. Thank you so much for coming today. So you mentioned kind of the difficulty, or even just like the lack of expressions that we have in English, like naimen. Like how would you even render that, you know? And so that's something I've thought about. And so I guess I'm curious about like your stance on foreignization versus domesticization. Like I've not yet read any of your works, but so I'm curious how you would even render naimen. Like, is that something that you would just have in italics and then you would want the reader to look and, you know, have them exert effort in order to understand what that phrase is, or would you try to find an English equivalent?
Yeah. Yeah, in that case, something like that, where we just simply, nothing would go in its place in English, we would want to italicize in that particular, you know, and I know that different people have different views of like footnotes to translations. I personally believe in them because honestly, there are certain things that you can't gloss them in the text in any meaningful way. You'll just be getting in the way of the story. At the same time, you don't want to leave it out, and you don't want to leave the reader in the dark. So my solution is to, let's say, put that in italics, and then either in a glossary later, you know, back in the back, or in the front, or in footnotes, just say something about that. about what it means and how it's used.
Sheikha?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sheikha. Thank you for the wonderful talk and sharing your experiences. In the beginning, you mentioned about being immersed in the Egyptian culture, and so cultural immersion was definitely a big part of your translation. And I was just wondering about how some of those conversations, some of those voices, tones, intonations traveled back to your translation and maybe enhanced it, or maybe not even posed hurdles, and I'm thinking here particularly of the multiple identities that you might have negotiated, as a translator, as a scholar, graduate student coming from the US and staying there.
Yeah, well, so my immersion was in Jordanian culture, so it was Jordanian, Palestinian, and so particularly, let's say, if I was translating Ibrahim Nasrallah, who is himself Palestinian, and who he inserts a little bit of colloquial in his dialogue, just enough to give you the feel of the colloquial without actually leaving the standard Arabic behind. So that's another interesting debate in Arabic literary circles. Some authors have actually tried to all of their dialogue, let's say in the colloquial, and all of the narration in formal. He has this nice kind of compromise where he puts a little bit of the colloquial in the dialogue. And so, having lived in a place where they speak that, I get the feel. It's nice. I like that, especially since it's a dialect that I'm familiar with. And I'm sure that for native speakers, it's the same. It gives them that feel of home. Now, I think I've lost the train of your thought. What's your question again?
Yeah, so how that might have enhanced your translation or even posed
Yes,
hurdles.
okay. So since I lived in that context, yes, it enhanced it for me very much because I could feel the jokes would be funnier or the feel would be more intense. Now, if I'm translating something by Ahlam, for example, who's Algerian, and there's Algerian colloquial, that won't help me at all. I have to ask her, what did they mean? What does that mean? I won't be able to decipher it. So the advantage was when I was doing a novel by someone that spoke the same dialect that I've been immersed in. But if it's some other dialect, it wouldn't make any difference really. In fact, no, on the contrary, it would make it more difficult because I wouldn't be able to hear it in my mind. I don't know what it's supposed to sound like, and I don't know how that translates into the standard Arabic.
Aaron, and then Kevin.
Hi, I'm Aaron, and just thank you again so much for sharing your thoughts and your work with us today. My question is you've kind of talked about it a little bit here in the Q&A, but just in terms of the actual texts themselves, what have been some of the biggest challenges you faced, whether that's, in translating humor or moving between the alphabets or certain sentence structure? Are there any challenges that were particularly thorny for you? And then how did you kind of find a creative solution to that problem?
Let's see. It's hard to pinpoint just one, but for example, in Gaza Weddings, there are some passages where there are lots of plays on words. So yeah, oh my goodness, yeah. So okay, what do I do with this? So because you just can't do it completely right, you're not going to be able to do it. So what I did was I did some footnoting with that, a little note that this, because otherwise it just completely loses its point. I could of course just forget. Well, I couldn't because it was part of the dialogue. It was part of what made the dialogue work in the Arabic was the plays on words. So those are very hard. Let me see. I mean, a lesser challenge is when you just have lots of vocabulary that's completely unfamiliar. It just simply doesn't exist in the English. And But basically, that's not so difficult because you can italicize and then put a note. Now, Ahlam, she's an Algerian writer that I translated 3 books for. Oh, she is very hard to translate. Very hard. Her language is very, 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 very flowery. Very poetic. Lots of plays on words. And there's always the, so how close do I try to adhere to her floweriness without sounding ridiculous? And, you know, because the last one I did in particular, it hasn't found a publisher yet. We didn't have a publisher and she just commissioned me to do it. And I don't know. I feel happy with it, but she has said, oh, so-and-so says, you just didn't make it poetic enough. I said, okay. And what do they mean? I don't know exactly because I'll read it and I'll think, I personally think I did a pretty good job, but it's subjective, and her language is very self-conscious. She's completely the diametric opposite of Najwa Bin Shatwan. Najwa wants to tell a story, and she tells that story. And she doesn't care if you're thinking about her or not. But there's a sense in Ahlam's work, she's very self-conscious. I know it, and you're going to know it. I mean, maybe that's unfair to her, but that's the way I feel. But of course she's masterful. It's amazing. Oh, yes, it's beautiful. So she's one of the authors that's very hard to translate. And it just, the challenge just goes on from page 1 to the end of the book for the most part.
Hi, my name is Michaela. I'm sorry, I apologize I arrived very late. So I have a couple of questions related to, as a follow-up to the question on the audience. So I apologize if you already mentioned this point.
That's fine.
No, okay. So the first question would be, so you asked about the audience, the American audience. So my question is, so what do you think is the difference in audience of, with respect to the 2 different experiences of slavery? How the respective societies have coped with this experience? And so do you think that such a difference emerges from the book so that an American audience can actually read through the line this difference? And then the second question is still about the audience. It was a little bit different. So you mentioned about the translation on Palestinian borders. And then I was very, it really caught my attention the fact that you said that they have been translated but nothing has changed. So my question is also, what should have been changed? It's also, like, what is your role as a translator in this sense? What do you think, like, a translation of these words should bring to society as a change in the audience? Or
It should solve the crisis immediately.
No, yeah.
For translation,
It's all our fault.
No.
They're still fighting.
No, absolutely.
All our fault.
But that's very interesting that, that's the really power of translation. So it's like not just the book. The idea that book is not maybe political because it's a fiction, but it might have some consequences in the life.
Right. Okay, now I apologize to you now because I'm going to need to go back and ask you to explain your first question.
Okay.
I didn't really fully understand.
Well, we can start for the second if you want.
Okay. Okay.
I know.
So the first, I think, if I can rephrase,
Yeah.
was how you help your American audiences read between the lines, but they're not looking for what they understand as slavery, and they can approach Libyan.
No, actually, it was a follow-up on your question in the sense that, so you asked about a different audience. You said, well, you translated this experience in Libya and then the reader is an American audience who may have experienced or has experienced actually as a society slavery and then is trying to cope with this experience.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that for an American audience reading this book, you could see this difference, emerging from the book? Like there are 2 differences. So I think the implied question is, for what audience is the book reading? So who is going to read it? Who read it? And so how that may affect differently.
Okay. Well, I would imagine that Najwa Bin Shatwan was initially, she wrote the book in Arabic. And so she was speaking to Arabs. I would imagine that she was initially addressing her own Libyan people, and saying, "Here, this is part of what our history is about." She herself, she happened to see a picture of the actual slave yards on somebody's desk. She thought, "What is that?" And she was intrigued, and that was the beginning of her decision to, first of all, do research into slavery in Libya, and then to write that novel. So it was a personal odyssey for her, and I don't think that she was thinking, now, what are those Americans going to think if they read this in translation? I doubt if that ever crossed her mind.
Sure, of course.
Yes. So basically, I don't think that she had that in her mind. And now that it's been translated, I would say that it's. I can't speak for readers, and I don't know what a white person, Anglo-Saxon will feel when they read this, except for my own experience. What Black Americans will feel or think when they write this, when they read it. We can only know that by actually talking to them. It'd be very interesting to, let's say, have it as a class reading, and maybe in an African Studies class or something, and then let the students say what it was they felt. And so I think it's kind of hard to theorize about this. And then your second question was?
Oh, the Palestinian the Palestinian writers translator.
Yeah.
Because you said, they have been translated a lot, but nothing has changed. So do you see yourself as a translator, like doing what kind of work in the long run? Or like what's your?
I mean, my work as a translator is my work as a translator. And I may be a political activist as well, and I may go out in the streets and demonstrate with the Palestinians. And that's probably going to, that would probably do more good than the translation work itself. But, I mean, I know there's a lot of talk now about translation as a political act and so forth. I don't know how effective translation can be as a political act. I think that translation is a service. I see myself as a servant to the author, and servant in the best sense of the word. I mean, I want to convey their voice and their message. I find I'm privileged to do that, and that's where my role ends. If I do that faithfully, then the response of the audience is beyond my control. And so, and in terms of why things haven't changed, it's certainly not because translators have failed to translate these documents. It's because of greed for power, greed for money, the same, tragic human experience that we see played out all over the world right now. But it's much more economic and political than it is literary. Yeah.
Thank you. There were two questions in the back, so maybe let's make a U shape, and I think that'll probably end up putting us close to time. So I know Will, and then two behind, and one here.
Hello, my name is Will. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I was just thinking in the Q&A here about the social relationships that you develop through translation, and in particular the way you have to consult and reach out to people and ask and build relationships. And I'm wondering, especially kind of the different relationships that you have built with different authors. Some sound kind of collaborative, some sound kind of not combative, but at least there's a deal of suspicion and territoriality mixed in with it. and also the relationships you build with informants like your husband, your mother-in-law, and just I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the kinds of the social and the collectivity that's built with translation, and whether certain authors or publishers allow you more agency, or whether they keep you on a tight rein. I know, for example, Valeria Luiselli, who wrote the story of my teeth in Spanish, she actually allowed, it was kind of a collaborative writing process with some factory workers, and then she also allowed her English language translator to kind of take the authorial reins every so often. I'm just wondering what kind of social relationships and agency you built through translation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Let's see. Well, I'd like to start with an experience that goes way back to maybe 2000. And that was when I was translating a non-fiction work by Muhammad Ramadan Butli. And I was encountering things that I felt he was talking about women in Islam and in the West. And I felt that he had misunderstood certain things, and I was uncomfortable with what I was being asked to translate. I mean, I had chosen to translate the book, but sometimes you read a book, and then when you actually begin translating it, then you say, "Oh my goodness, yeah, I feel bad." So I was trying to, number one, be accurate, and number two, convey the message in a way that would be more acceptable, or there would be more receptivity to it in the English language audience. So I suggested some things, and the author was absolutely closed-minded entirely. I had no right to do this. And he said to the publisher, "She translates the way it is, or you can find another translator." So I thought, okay. So then the publisher, though, then stepped in a little bit and said, "Okay, all right, hold your horses." And they said, "Okay, we ask you to translate it the way it is, but you can put translator's notes." So they allowed this kind of compromise. So that was definitely a rather combative relationship. Then there's some examples that say with fiction writers, and it's been interesting, the kind of gamut. Ahlam was the enemy, for example, the very self-conscious one. Strangely unhelpful. She would be strangely unhelpful when I'd ask certain questions. She'd say, "It doesn't really matter. Well, honey, I want to know what you meant. Just explain what you mean." And I felt that she didn't want to bother herself with explaining. I thought, well, don't you want me to ask? I felt frustrated at times. And so I would just deal with it however I could, even though I knew that if she'd wanted to, she could have, it seemed to me, explained exactly what she meant. And so she's one example. Then another that was very collaborative, Haji Dabit. He's an Eritrean author that I've just recently translated for. And I'll ask him about something. That doesn't quite fit. And he'll say, "Oh yeah, throw it out." Just leave it out. I said, "Okay," he said, I trust you completely. And it's, a lovely feeling. And there's another, Isaac Kamhawi. He wrote Beit al-Dib, or The House of the Wolf. And it's very odd. There were a lot of inconsistencies in the novel. I mean, he'd forget, he'd call the character by the wrong name. Somewhere later, I'd say, "No, I don't think that's who you meant. Did you mean so-and-so?" And they'll say, "Oh, you're right." Like, oh my goodness. He was so humble. He was so sweet. He didn't take offense at all. So, let's see. Ibrahim Nasrallah, of course, he's always been wonderful. Just always writes right back immediately. So many of them. I mean, I swear an hour later I get my answers. They're so happy, that the translator is asking them questions. In fact, one time Ibrahim said something like, there's nothing that scares me more than a translator that doesn't ask any questions. So it's been a really rich experience, and the combative experiences are. Oh, Ibrahim al-Koni is just a little bit. He's a little bit combative, but not too. I think he really does like to be asked questions, but sometimes I'll feel a little bit. I don't know. That I'm stepping on his toes a wee bit.
Hi, I'm Tia. Your talk is super interesting. So I'm wondering if you know or do you have information of all these books that you have translated have been translated in other languages, especially the language in Africa and Middle Eastern world. And do you have any connections with other translators, or do you know their kind of perceptions in any kind of African or Middle Eastern countries in other kind of language translations?
Okay. Now I apologize. Could you repeat your question? I didn't quite understand what you're asking me.
So do you know if you have any information of all these your translated books have been translated in any other kind of African or Middle Eastern languages? Or do you know if they have kind of certain perceptions in the local kind of communities in Africa or Middle East?
Okay. Well, of course, first of all, I only translate from Arabic into English. And so I don't really have information about, let's say, are you asking about whether these books that I've translated into English have been translated into other languages?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's information that I wouldn't have. I would have to ask the author themselves, if those works have been translated or not. So I'm sorry, I don't have information about that.
Yes, hello, I'm Graham. I was struck by the sort of declarative statement that you made that you're not quite sure, or that you don't think translation has much political use. Bringing us back to Palestine one more time, you said that even though you weren't under any illusion that you would really change any opinions, that it was still worth doing, or that it was still a good thing to do. And this kind of reminded me of how you started your talk about your religious experience and your spiritual experience. And I wonder if translation doesn't have a political use, does it have some kind of spiritual use for you or for those who read translations? And can that offer some sort of condolences, or can that make the fact that political transformation through translation is difficult, or maybe even impossible?
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, it definitely has spiritual, cultural, emotional importance. If I didn't think it had any importance at all, I don't know if I would be able to do it. The attitudes, I mean, in an indirect way, it may be helping toward political change. So, for example, if it increases awareness among the population that reads it, then definitely it can be having an effect. I mean, some of the most important peace initiatives between Palestinians and Israelis happen in quiet ways, building bridges between individuals and seeing each other as human beings. And literature is a very human thing. I mean, it's human beings expressing their emotions. So I didn't mean to come across as too cynical. I just mean that in the case of, let's say, the Palestinian issue, it seems it has become so intractable, and for reasons that are far greater than this or that novel can ever address. And but that doesn't mean I want to discount the role of translation at all. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Talib. I have two quick questions. One is, what dictionaries and resources do you use when translating? And two, in addition to all that you've so eloquently told us, what advice would you have to upcoming translators?
Okay. Well, first of all, regarding dictionaries, you know, the Bible of Arabic English dictionaries is Hansbeer. Mine always falls apart. Every single one I get, it always falls apart. And the last pages, I don't know where they went. And the cover always comes off. And I love that book. It's just so special. It will always be special. And I think it's the only Arabic English one that still goes by the detour. You know, you have to know the triliteral root, which is so good when I was learning Arabic because it forces you to, you know, take it back to its original root and then you go find it. Whereas a mouthpiece is a good dictionary, and it's good for other things. But for literature, Ansver is the best. And then I will not lie, I used Google Translate because, that's because for a couple of reasons. First of all, when it comes to like collocations, let's say a couple of words together, and especially if I'm doing non-literary translation for political, economic, oh my gosh, it's so helpful. The names of organizations, the names of new uses of words, it's great. Of course, sometimes it gives you gobbledygook and it's so funny. But if you know the language well enough, you know the difference between when Google Translate is helping you and when it's just being Google Translate. Yeah. And then of course I use, let's say I've got a phrase from poetry or that kind of thing. What you do is you can Google the phrase between parentheses or between quotation marks, and that way you get all instances of that particular thing. And or sometimes in Arabic I say ma'ana kada بالإنجليزية, and then it'll take me to different sites like what do they call them? Chat rooms, blogs, these forums, where translators share information. That's of course very helpful with legal translation, economic terms, not so much with literature, but so I use a combination of Hansver, Google Translate, searching through actually Arabic searches, and the other thing about Google Translate, it's actually a nice thesaurus. It works very nicely as a thesaurus. It'll give you, various possibilities, which is faster. Like Hansver is a nice thesaurus too, because he always gives lots of possibilities. But if you don't want to go and open your book, you can more quickly type it into Google Translate. Does that help?
It does.
And advice for up and coming translators.
Oh yeah, right. Let's see. Well, of course, translation is evolving, and so if you want to be a literary translator, you're going to focus on certain things, and if you want to be a commercial translator, you'll focus on other things. But honestly, personally, I think it's nice to be able to do both, and I do both. I wouldn't want to translate literature all the time. I need a break from just being, I have to be so creative, and I just don't feel like being creative sometimes, or trying to be eloquent. So I think it's great. You want to get a broad range of experience, the broader the better. If you want to make a lot of money, you get yourself a specialization in a technical field, computer science, biology, whatever. And then you use your two languages as a tool for translating in that particular field, and you can build yourself a very lucrative career in that way. So variety, and if you are really interested in making a lot of money, get yourself a really hot specialization, and And in terms of literary, you know, you need to be persistent, of course, and it's good to network. Networking is so important these days. Networking with other translators in your field. If you're not a member of an organization like American Translators Association, you should definitely become a member, because they have many resources, put you in touch with many people. I learned so much from colleagues. I was very isolated for a long time, actually. And then in the past year or two, I've become, just recently, I really realized how isolated I was, and I'm so happy to be in touch with colleagues. I learned from them. There's a forum now. It's a Google group called Arab Lit, and it's for Arabic translators. In order to join, I think you have to have one published translation, but it's a forum for sharing opportunities, sharing questions, and there are others as well. So those are some things that come to mind.
Thank you.
Well, Nancy, thank you so much for speaking with us today.